And I speak in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Hear me, he said to them, and I will tell you another story. Good morning, my friends. If the weather forecast is correct, we're in for another scorcher. As I prepared this sermon, I thought about two disparate events: Indigenous Peoples Day and Banned Book Week, which ended yesterday. I began to wonder whether these events were related, and if so, how. And as I thought about them, I realized that, yes, there is a common thread. And that thread is the stories we choose to tell ourselves. When I grew up, as is probably the case with some of you, we called Indigenous Peoples Day Columbus Day. I remember drawing Columbus's three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Those ships with their sails filled. I also remember parades, especially in New York City, with its large Italian population. And having Italian heritage, I felt a special connection to this history. Christopher Columbus, quote, discovered America after facing many hardships. His story was part of America's story. It was part of our story. A man of great daring set sail on a voyage that might lead him off the world's edge and into the great oblivion. He returned vindicated and triumphant. And of course, I also had the story of the first Thanksgiving, where Indigenous peoples and pilgrims met and lived in complete harmony. But over the last decades, something changed. We learned that history, our history, is fluid, and it's sometimes dynamic as we discover more than the simplified accounts that children hear. A case in point, I never knew that the Nina was named the Santa Clara and the Santa Maria was named La Gallega. The original names don't change the history, but it is one small example of what some of us thought was established and settled, but actually wasn't. As I wrote in our e-blast, October 9th is Indigenous Peoples Day, and the Episcopal dioceses and congregations across the United States prepared services and celebrations marking this day as part of a nationwide movement honoring our native peoples and their cultures. Last year was the first time our church celebrated this day since passing the resolution at the 80th General Convention. The resolution states, observance of Indigenous Peoples Day would serve as a celebration and a remembrance of the Indigenous peoples who have for thousands of generations safeguarded the land and who in the face of cultural genocide preserve their languages, traditions, stories, and ceremonies for future generations. Our celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day today allows us to recognize the ongoing presence of Native peoples in the Bay Area and consider how we tell our history of our community. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that some are unhappy with this change from celebrating Columbus Day to marking Indigenous Peoples Day. And part of me wonders why we couldn't have two celebrations. The fluidity of history, as I meditated and learned, sometimes upsets the stories we tell ourselves. And then we have to ask a question, what do we do? Another connection I made has to do with the banning of books and redacting histories some don't like. Yesterday was Let Freedom Read Day, promoting the idea that with more and more banned books, we should read them. In a recent PEN American study, the authors found over 3,000 books banned in U.S. public school classrooms and libraries. an increase of over 33% from the previous year. Unfortunately, banning books is often linked to ignoring or rewriting certain histories which are sometimes uncomfortable and often disturbing. We find similar issues in our Episcopal Church regarding slavery and our church's part in that history. It's not straightforward. Nevertheless, it's part of our history and a history that we need to acknowledge. I believe it is our Christian duty to seek the best information and listen to other voices to gain a new and richer understanding of who we are, which is why I gave an upended and non-conforming sermon about the laborers in the vineyard. It also is why we have been using the First Nations version of the New Testament. We are learning to listen with new ears. Today we heard another story about a vineyard. Vineyards played a vital role in the agriculture and literature of ancient Israel. A productive vineyard was a symbol of God's great generosity. Vineyards would be fruitful if the people observed God's commandments. Of course, Jesus used similar images of the vine and vine dressing to describe the nature of discipleship. And the vineyard could also be used as a symbol of God's judgment upon Israel. In the prophet Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard, he depicts Israel as the choicest of vines planted and nurtured by God, but despite God's grace, yielded sour fruit, only to be later destroyed because of Israel's failures. In this vineyard parable, Jesus describes another landowner. This time, the tribal member planted his vineyard, set up protection in a wine press, and then rented the vineyard out to other tribal members for a share of the grapes. But unlike the parable of the laborers, the owner doesn't need to hire laborers. He only needs to collect his share of the harvest from the tenants. But unlike the laborers, these tenants exercise a power denying the owner. The owner sent his slaves to collect his share, but the tenants killed some, beat and stoned others. He finally sent his son, who they also killed. It is a dark and troubling parable. There is no way to sugarcoat that. One of my clergy friends yesterday complained of its challenges and the unhappiness she had about having to preach on it. The parable challenges the listener to judge themselves. Think back to the parable Nathan tells David. Quote, "There are two men in a certain city, the one rich, the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come." David has the same reaction as Jesus' audience. He will bring those bad-hearted ones to a bad end. So what are we in this day and age to make of this parable? We could take the same approach as I did last time. The tribal member is a rich landowner who seizes the tenant's land, forces them to work the vineyard, and then takes all of the profits. The violence doesn't pay, and the tenants ultimately lose in the end, despite the costs to the owner. A more traditional view is God is the owner who sends out prophets and finally Jesus to convert. The religious hierarchy rejects Jesus and has him executed, and consequently, the Gentiles inherit the good news. And finally, some suggested that Jesus borrowed from Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard. In this interpretation, Jesus recounts Israel's history with a twist. He confronts the hierarchy, answering their challenges to his authority. Ultimately, this parable, like all of the parables, is about listening and how we respond. Do we follow our own agendas, ignoring or downplaying or outright rejecting Jesus' message of radical love of our neighbors? Or do we agree to live in a relationship with God, accepting the gift of grace that God freely offers? Jesus' interpretation of the parable reminds us that we cannot make assumptions about God's blessings. Our relationship with God is an opportunity. It only demands our response, our yes, or in Matthew earlier, the great Ave. And despite its difficulty and darkness, this parable invites us. It invites us to see with new eyes and find something unexpected in our relationship with God. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.